Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us again. If you remember the last podcast, we introduced the first podcast of a series of podcasts on introducing development, what development is about, what are the main issues of development. So today we're actually doing the second one of the series. We're going to be really taking it back. We're really going to be talking about what is development, where it comes from, and why it's there. Clearly, it's a podcast. It's not very long, so we can't go into too much detail about every single piece of it. But here we go. We will try to do the best we can within the period that we have. And maybe the first thing we can talk about is what was the situation like after colonialism or neocolonialism, officially as neocolonialism, or even slavery at some point ended. And then from there, maybe we can move on to what it actually means. You want to take a crack at it?
Okay. Well, I won't be able to go in order. But after colonialism, I would situate my context in Africa, because after colonialism, there was now the moral responsibility of the former colonial masters to make things right, more like to save them. We feel pity for you, this idea of saviorism, act of responsibility. And there was also a period where especially the Francophone African countries became highly indebted. A lot of them had to pay for the colonialism. And some of them even had to sign pacts to even continue the colonialism. So there was that. And then these two major events after colonialism.
So if we look at that part, but also look at like the situation of the people living in these countries, whether they were colonized or not at that time, and we take that and we compare it to the people's situations living in the so-called developed world as they were then started to be known, you can see this distinction between the two groups. You can see in the developed world, so-called, there was this better lifestyle or pace of living, and this is in no way a generalization of everybody living in these countries. Clearly, there were groups who were suffering and other groups who were doing well. But in general, it was thought that the situation of people's lives in the developed so-called world was way better than those in the so-called developing world. And the idea was that we can't leave them suffering like that. Mm-hmm. We have to help them. Yes. We have the solutions, more or less. Look at us. We were able to do it. We want to save you for not having to go through it for 100 or so years, making all the mistakes that we made. Mm-hmm. And so because of that, and the ethical and moral underpinnings behind it, especially when it comes to the suffering of people, we want to help you. And we want to help you with the idea of having democracy, human rights, rule of law. Again, depending on who you were talking about and which countries and what style of democracy. Liberal economies in general. Peace, because it was considered that there were so many wars, or clearly some of it were independence wars. Yeah. Some of it were against the colonial masters. Some of it were basically due to the Cold War thereafter, who you aligned yourself with, whether it was the Soviet Union or whether you aligned yourself with the Western world or you were non-aligned, depending. But the idea that we need to bring peace, we are peaceful, they're not in many cases, so we need to help them get to that peace. And then that sort of role of sort of the idea that because we went through all this with so many years of experience, mm-hmm. we have the expertise. Yes. So we want to sort of help you. Mm-hmm. And linked to what you're saying as well, I think it's the idea of how, especially in countries that were previously colonized, how they earned their independence. Mm-hmm. Where in some countries, due to the fact that they asked for their independence, they owed a debt to the previous colonial governments or masters. In other places, their industries were destroyed once the colonialists left. In some places, they instigated wars or supported different militias or different groups. And so we have to kind of look at that totality of it. In Africa and in other places as well. It's not just an issue on the African continent. And so if we look at it from that perspective, we see that the idea was that there's so much suffering over there, not necessarily connected to the history of what we did, some were aware of that,
Yes.
but not necessarily the case. There's so much suffering over there. We have a moral and ethical duty, knowing what we know, seeing that it worked here, to actually go and help.
Them. But then I think another aspect that sometimes we don't often speak about too much is that in building these developed countries, a lot of the efforts were from these these colonies or former colonies, as would now have it. Let's say they contributed a lot in terms of like labor to constructing the developed countries, but then we don't really talk about their efforts towards development. We only see, we just got here, it was so simple, we are coming back to help you, without saying that you were actually part of the reasons why we are now developed.
Yeah, and also some of the issues as well after independence was like the oil crisis.
Yeah.
So there isn't also this willingness to accept that part of the responsibility of the bigger players went into causing the oil crisis.
Yes.
That then really hurt a lot of countries that were already indebted for various reasons. And hurting them in that sense meant that they were suffering even more. And then they were obliged, in some cases, due to liquidity issues, they were obliged to turn to these same actors that at the international level made decisions that impacted the price of oil, the price of agriculture, the price of basic foods that then caused crises within these countries. And so a lot of the external, if we remember, last podcast was about the policy space, so looking at all of these factors. So a lot of the external impacting the internal, and and there wasn't that much realization of that. It was more of, over there, you don't have proper macroeconomic stability. You're not making the proper decisions when it comes to your economy. You're not making the proper decisions when it comes to your policies, your politics. And therefore, here, we think that by implementing a democratic system, by implementing a good justice system, by implementing liberal economies, neoliberal in some cases, by following up on proper macroeconomic stability policies, then you would be saved from your situation. So it was very much a sort of over there versus over here. And the other part, I think, that also plays a role in kind of understanding a lot of this development and how we define it and what it's used for, is the fact that an aspect that more recently has been talking about a little bit more, which is the foreign policy. Right? It's really a tool of foreign policy. And it was used as a tool of foreign policy to access other countries, to improve the geopolitics or the power of the geopolitics of that country giving the aid. In that region, they're giving the aid. Again, part of the Cold War or part of that sort of economic supremacy or wanting to be the leader of the world, economically speaking, getting more powerful. Even regionally, sometimes looking at the implications of that geopolitics, like, for example, the U.S. in Latin America or in the Caribbean. So that foreign policy angle made significant difference in a sense where you could look at it from an ethical and moral perspective. But if you actually look at it from a foreign policy perspective, there is a good reason for an economic answer. There's a good reason for a political answer. There's a good reason for a security answer. All of that part of the geopolitics. And the economic answer was opening up other economies for the benefit of the more powerful economic countries, and the trickle-down effect that eventually will help these countries, which we see has been very controversial because we haven't really seen much of the results of it. The politics of supporting certain leaders that sometimes undermine the idea of democracy or the values of democracy and the promotion of democracy in these countries. And then other times, trying to overthrow certain leaders as well. And then you had the idea of security, which, naval bases, for example, what happened with Cuba, and then naval bases against, the Soviet Union and the encroachment of communism, but also other naval bases or other aerial bases or whatever is military or otherwise in these countries to show and demonstrate the power of that country. So what we talk less about is that aspect of development and that aspect of the idea of development, which really has had a lot of benefits for countries that actually use it, whether it be, again, economic, political, security, or even just geopolitics in general, and the power of these countries in that region and the influence that they have.
And then going back to economic, I feel like sometimes we describe development in very simplistic terms so that we make it look as if it's a very linear path, like the modernization theory, where we just talk about point A to point B without putting it into context and how even countries have not recovered from colonization. But we always think it doesn't have an impact. It happened a very long time ago. Why do we want to talk about it? Why is it important? But then it's still playing a very huge role in how countries have developed. And even developed countries took so much more time to get to the point where they are now. But I feel like developing countries still need more time to make their mistakes and then correct them and now find their own pathway to development, as opposed to following a straight path, which they have followed in the time past, but we haven't seen much of it.
And I think it is also that idea, I think that you just raised, which is the idea of one definition of what development is. And that definition being linked to what the Western world has experienced as development, and the idea that this is something that's so technical and then so it's a given that everybody needs to follow this path of development. And more or less, though, because as we know, their history of development is not necessarily what they prescribe as development for other countries or as suggestions for development. So there's also that idea, not only is it from an economic point of view, but there's also this idea of this is what it's supposed to look like. And this is the idea of development. These are the engagement. And then you stay within that specific box. And it's that box. You can move around within it, and you can choose different adjustments to it. But really, this is the definition of development. And it's that idea that, we have the solution for the rest of the world from sort of a Western perspective. We can help the rest of the world. And if you don't attain this, and you can see this with a lot of the indicators of development, if you don't attain this, it means you're not doing well from a development perspective and you're not heading in the right direction. So above and beyond the idea of morality, the idea of foreign policy and geopolitics is really that idea of this is the right way. You cannot deviate from the right way. And giving spaces to do something different is risky because we don't know what would come out of doing something different. We know what would come out of what you're supposed to do because look at us. And so there's also this idea of what development is and that space to look at it from a different perspective. All in all, there are people working on different definitions of development and trying to look at it from a different perspective. But all in all, that space is quite limited within that box. And I think a lot of us who want to understand what development is need to truly understand not only what is being done, how it's understood, what is perceived, what values underpin all of this, and how do we understand the instrumentalization of these values and what space is left to do things differently. And that's why I referenced the policy space. Because again, if we have an idea and this is what it's supposed to look like in the Western world and with the multilateral institutions that are more or less influenced significantly by the Western world, they're all heading in that direction. It's really hard to get off the train and try something different. And it's that idea of development, I think, at the base and that strictness and that monopolization within that box. Not that everything is suggested perfectly as it is, but it's within the limits of the box. And there's a train. You get off that train, it's questionable. You get on that train, you're on the right track if you do things properly. I think that's what we have to work with, and that's what we have to understand. And that's why a lot of people have criticized development to say, well, why can't we try something different? Why can't we look at it from a different perspective? So I think that's sort of where we'll end it, because that discussion of why can't we try something different is all about a discussion about decolonization, and it's a discussion about looking at various forms and formats of development and theories of development. We'll put that aside because it would take us too long to be able to go into that. But I think, again, the message is where it came from a historic perspective that resulted from potentially guilt of what was done during colonial times and slavery. And the guilt of being in a world where you could afford to eat when you see other people suffering. And why it's there, because there's a view and an understanding of what's supposed to be, where it's supposed to go, how it's supposed to be, and that there's this idea that we can guide it to that. And it's really very much one that raises, I think, a lot more questions than it actually answers. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We will be having more in these series. We'll discuss more some of these basic ideas. So we'd like you to join us again and keep following us. Thank you.